So what I did think about after watching the last video, like I told you, was just how incredibly unanimated I was about the topic, and I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about, well, what is it that kind of drives the research in this topic? What is it that interests me? Why? What is it that I can get sort of animated about? And I think partly it's because I stuck very close to what my topic is, and like I've also said, like I also, with this PhD, I'm trying to learn how to do research, and what has been my biggest interest while doing that is really to collect ideas and means of finding things out. I like collecting methods together and having like this toolbox of that I can sort of pull out and try, like, well, now I'll try this and see what happens when I do this, and see what happens when I do a different method, and what can I learn with these tools. And partly that's been my approach in the PhD, so that it maybe has taken longer for that reason to get anything kind of useful, well, not useful, but sort of to have a path to go along. Because I'd like to try out different things and see what happens. And it's more important for me to try out a bunch of different things and to find out what kind of research I want to do. Not in terms of the topic. I feel like, okay, the topic isn't irrelevant, but there are so many topics that I could quite happily work on. For me, it's much more important to have a way of going about doing research, or going about understanding things. Because I can't imagine spending the rest of my life working on the health topic and going narrower and narrower and narrower into one area of research. And that's partly because one of the reasons why I chose to do the research on health in agriculture is because we're so bad as a society of connecting the usefulness of agriculture with other areas of society. So we don't take advantage of the opportunities that are in agriculture to affect social relationships, to affect, like we were talking about, the rural communities. There's a huge possibility of having stronger rural communities that draw from their agricultural base, and I mean, a lot of farmers are quite educated. I mean, here a lot of the students that come to this university will return to their farms. They've lived in the big city, and they've had the taste of the cultural aspects the big city can provide. They've experienced the social relationships that a city can provide, and for me, there's no reason why you can't bring a lot of that back to rural communities. The difference between cities and rurality doesn't have to be so big, and you don't have to lose all of the services that that are being lost. By having a vibrant agricultural sector that you place some value on, and don't just value for what's being put out of it, like what the output is. So the point is just that agriculture connects to an awful lot of different areas, and it's been used in small projects to affect different areas. There was a really interesting project in England where they took inmates from a prison, so inmates who were fairly close to being released from prison, and had them work on farms to gain some skills and to reintegrate into community and to feel that they're doing something valuable and feel a bit more like normal people, because prisons are basically the least healthy place you can put someone. They're just the isolation and that feeling of shame, I suppose, that's built into every aspect of the prison. I think working on the farm and interacting with the other farm labourer and working as part of a team, doing something where you see the results really quickly, really clearly, you can really you can see how that has a useful effect for society. And it's been done in lots of small projects. And I would say that could be considered a health project. It's at least mental health project and community health project. But it's not really been done on a big scale. These connections haven't really been made. And you see it at the ministry level where the connections aren't made. Here the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Health are jointly responsible for organic agriculture in this country. And in talking to the different people who are involved with these ministries, the one person says, well, we're responsible for the environmental, making sure that the farms meet the environmental standards, and we're responsible for actually paying out the subsidies. And then the other side says, well, we're responsible for food safety in organic agriculture and for deciding what the subsidies get based on. And you think, well, for one thing, there's a big crossover between food safety and environmental health. But there's also a huge gap of other things that agriculture does that is not being addressed at all by anyone in the ministries. And if you want it to have a positive effect, then you have to at least recognize the possibility of having a positive effect. It's a bit like, I think it was Donella Meadows who wrote about that you don't get the system that you want, and you don't get the system that you deserve in a way. You get the system that you measure for. And if you don't measure for the health benefits of agriculture, well then you don't build a system that produces that, because you're not putting any importance on it. And if you don't measure for health effects in agriculture, then you don't build that into the system in a way. It might happen accidentally, but you're not building it into the system. And by measure, I mean, it doesn't have to be quantifiable measures, but it's just thinking about how do we check whether or not it's having a good health effect or not? Can we look for it? It's bothering to look, basically. And I think that's you can see it now with the organic here, that nobody's looking for the health effects. People are looking for the economic aspects, and they're looking at the environmental aspects. And you hear a lot of talk about that there's only a small subset of the organic farmers in Austria who are real organic farmers, meaning that they subscribe to the values and the history and the traditions of organic agriculture. And for me, that's just an indication that the system that people are building for organic agriculture is not actually capturing those values. Because the real organic farmers is whoever you let into the organic movement, whoever you allow to practice organic agriculture. So to say that the people who are just doing it for the subsidies aren't real organic farmers, well, then you have to say, well, we have to prevent people who are just doing it for the subsidies from being organic farmers. And it comes back to what it is you have as criteria for entry. If you don't have values and adherence to this long tradition as a criteria for entry into organic agriculture, then the system isn't going to just it's not going to know that instinctively. You will have some organic farmers who are very interested in the values, but you will also have a bunch of people who are doing it because they, for whatever reasons that you allow people to enter into that form of farming. And I think, I can understand why health in a broad sense isn't a criteria, or why values in a way aren't criteria for entry into the movement, because you'd have a much, much smaller movement. And the pressure on the organic movement has been to grow for, well, at least the last 20 years, I suppose, just to grow and to increase the market share. And you see what statistic do you hear about organic the most? It's what's the market share of organic now relative to conventional. And the internal sort of development of the movement has been slightly set aside. And when you think about which health measures are most talked about with regard to organic, it's nutritional value or pesticide residues in comparison with conventional. And so that there's a danger that that's all that health with an organic will be in some years' time. It'll just be a question of, is it more nutritious, and is it does it have fewer pesticide residues? And that's fine, but it's again missing the opportunity to talk about health in a much broader way and to take advantage of the linkages of what that agriculture has to offer. And for me, it would be a loss to the movement that has a really strong history of redefining what health means. It was part of the late 1800s, early 1900s redefinition of health that took into account environment where it hadn't really done that much before. So to say that a factory is unhealthy if the air quality is really bad, and to say that the things that we are using in agriculture are making us sick. The inputs or the food that we're producing is making us sick, both in the production phase and in the processing phase, or that inequality is making us sick, is affecting health and affecting the health possibilities that we have. So organic was part of this discussion at that time, and it was the pioneers of the movement were very involved with bringing environment into the health discussion and saying, well, we need to have a healthy environment, and when we live in a healthy environment, we have much more scope to be healthy, or much more possibilities to be healthy ourselves. And so it would be a shame now to to limit what health is to nutritional value and pesticide residues, in a way continuing the tradition that the pioneers started, of saying we need to look at these things, and we do need to look at those things, but in another sense really neglecting the current discussions that are going on about how else can we expand this health concept, how else can we use, or what else can agriculture be in society other than an output of nutritious food and other than an output of various chemicals. And what we are doing in the working group is really to say, what else can agriculture be? What other roles can agriculture play in society? And can it have some kind of transformative capacity for various social relationships? Can it transform the relationship between urban and rural communities? Can it transform how we buy food, how we eat, how we engage with animals, how we engage with nature, how we communicate, how we travel? And that, to me, building those connections between agriculture and other social sectors is really interesting to me. And the health part is absolutely one area that seems very natural to deal with this with agriculture, because the health effects in terms of illnesses and possibilities in terms of improving health, preventing illnesses, or strengthening, giving people resilience, it's almost untapped. It's not been much on the radar at all. There are a few people who are working on it in England that I know of, who are really trying to push it into policy to say, well, what else can we do with agriculture to improve, maintain health, or to prevent illness or treat illness. But it's not really that much on the radar yet, and there's a huge scope for it to have really positive effects. But if we're not looking at that, then any positive effects it will have will just be by coincidence, just accidental outcomes, and not built into the structure of what agriculture is in society. And then the question is like, well, why look at the meaning of health in relation to that, and look at farmers' understanding of the meaning of health in relation to that? And that it is a step away from this very grand idea, I suppose, this bigger idea. But it's not only agriculture that needs to change, it's also the health system that needs to change, and the two need to change together in order for them to actually have any kind of synergies, or co-benefits, and to do that you need to be able to interpret health in a way that you see it as a relevant thing for agriculture to be dealing with. And it's no good for academics to see this connection. And, well, there is some good in that, obviously, but it's not enough for policymakers to see it. It's not enough for academics to see it. None of that really matters unless the farmers see it that way. Unless they see that the work that they're doing is relevant for health in a broader scope. And I don't think it's fair to ask them to have to take on this responsibility, which is kind of what you're doing. You're saying, like, you produce health outcomes, positive and negative, and they should all be positive, so go make them positive. And it's not really fair to ask them to do that if they don't see a sense of relevance or purpose in that. And so that's kind of what I wanted to find out by looking at the understandings of health.
You mentioned one example of a farm community that had, in a very broad and in a sort of unexpected way, beneficial effects on the health of the community by helping with this problem, this huge problem of the reintegration of criminals into the society. I'm wondering, could you dig back in your memory and find the examples you're working from? And that's one, surely. But are there others of health in that broader sense being promoted by agricultural enterprises, by farms, by farm communities?
It's difficult because it's easy to go back to the fact that every community that's based around agriculture feels the effect of the agriculture that's around it. And if you have, it's easy to come up with negative examples, as I suppose what I'm trying to say, where as farms get bigger, for example, and become more mechanized, they don't need to draw labor from the rural communities anymore. There aren't as many farmers anymore. They perhaps aren't buying as much locally anymore. They're not having their machines repaired locally anymore. And so the negative effects for the community, it's like the death of the rural community is at least in great part due to this change in the way agriculture is structured. And that's something that you can see over the past 50, 60 years of this development. But in terms of the positive examples, there's a lot of work with like the green care movement across. There's a lot of it in Europe and some in the US, where they're placing people on farms for various forms, to do various forms of work, to have holidays basically from their stressful jobs, or to learn how to be in nature again, to learn how to produce food, that then goes back to the cities. So you have, what they're trying to set up here is where managers and executives from big businesses go for 2-3 days probably at most, to stay on a farm, to help produce the food, to spend time in nature, spend time talking to the farmers, and to get away from the city a bit, and to take that with them when they leave again, so that there's a positive effect for the farm in terms of getting a bit of extra income, and to an extent some help on the farm. But there's also then a bigger benefit for the urban areas where they can bring this. They can have a way of actually escaping the city and learning some skills and learning a bit about food that they can bring back to the cities. And in that small way, that's changing the relationship between the city and the rural areas in a way that could be beneficial for health. But in quite a what am I trying to say? It's still very much keeping the two apart. You travel there and you do something for a little while and it's nice and relaxing, and then you go back to exactly what you had before. And I guess the idea is that over time you'd start making changes in your life to try to have more relaxation, to think more about food and where food comes from, and then have a bigger effect in the urban areas through that. The other examples would probably be school farming projects that can have really quite fantastic effects, where either there's a farm that the students go to work and to cook and learn about nature, or an actual farm, a mini farm, that the students run themselves. And I've seen a couple of examples of that in the US that I thought worked really well. The first one was a primary school, I think, I think it was only a primary school, where the students they started the garden themselves, and they raised everything themselves. It started just with little vegetable patches, and then they added some chickens, and then they got a goat, or they had 2 goats, and it sort of grew and grew and grew, and they added a weather monitoring station. And initially it was just meant to be a class on producing some food and learning a bit of the history of their culture in a way, because this had been a farming area, and not so much now, but it had been an area where a lot of their families had, at the time they moved there, had been involved with food and food production. And then after a while they found that the biology classes were going out there to have a little look for insects, or look at plants and study the wildlife, look at the ecology of the place. And so they were using the farm or the garden as an interactive classroom. And then the maths classes would go there, and they would go to count, they go collect the seeds and they count the seeds. And the history classes would have be involved with the garden, where they created a Native American wilderness area to show how they use different plants in this region. And over time, the parents got involved with this, and it just grew into a centre or a focus for so much of what happened in the school. The sad thing was it didn't actually affect the school lunches at all. They still had the quite sad looking processed. The day I was there, they had cheeseburgers and a little bag of frozen carrots, which I don't think were meant to be frozen, but they were. And so it hadn't really, one of the ways it hadn't been incorporated was in terms of the food that the students were eating. But you could see that the community had changed around this. It had had a very positive effect on the interactions between people. The students were getting up and they were moving around and they were out in the fresh air. And they were working and they were doing something where they could, they could see the outcomes, and they could see the outcomes in the short term, they could see the outcomes in the long term. It was a really good strengthener for that school community. And you could call that health if you wanted to. Certainly there were physical health effects of it. There was the children were very happy to go out in the garden, and I think you could call it a bunch of other things as well. But it's taking the step of saying that food production doesn't just have to be about output. It can be about an awful lot of things. When people start getting involved with it, they start. It changes the way they interact, and it changes the way they think about the processes that they're part of. And that, I think, was a very good example of for me, of what the outcome could look like. And this was with a lot of school children, but it could do similarly with a community of adults. Although it was in a very wealthy neighborhood, and I don't know if the opportunity would have been there in a poorer neighborhood. And it was kind of a reinforcing feedback where the parents in this wealthy area really loved this idea, and so they applied for more and more of the grants to build these, to continue to expand this project, which means, of course, that other people aren't getting these grants to get these things. So in that sense, it didn't help the health of that particular system, or it didn't, making the connection to other social inequalities wasn't necessarily there. But things like immigration could be dealt with, or different nationalities producing some plants that are culturally relevant to them was important, and trying out different things. I think that did some good. And the other school farm project that I visited while I was there was an actual farm that was located next to a school, and they decided that they would have a class, not a compulsory class, but just an elective, for students to go work on that farm for a little bit, and then they would learn about how to produce different things and how to prepare them for food. And the purpose there was very much health, so how to get the students to eat healthy. And so the food that they were preparing was always very fresh and rich, and I think they had kale chips when I was there. And that also seemed like a nice enterprise, but it hadn't, again, for me, that was very much focused on the output of food. Food can be healthy, which is good to teach them, but there was a lot more that could happen around that as well.
When you talked before, you made reference to a school in Switzerland, or a farm community in Switzerland that particularly impressed you. I wonder if that comes into this discussion.
Absolutely, and in a way, it's that would probably be the the prime example for me of a farm that is healthy and that is really rethinking what it means to be a farm. Because they took over an existing farm and converted it to a biodynamic farm, dairy farm for the most part. And then it expanded and expanded, and they have vegetable production. They have a seed production enterprise where they produce one of not too many biodynamically certified seeds, and they have a slaughterhouse that's connected to the farm. They have a hotel that's connected to the farm. They have conference rooms that are all connected to the farm. They've sort of expanded and expanded and expanded, in a sense, or diversified, I should say. And they've done this on the principle of asking, well, how can we integrate this community in what we're doing? How can we be part of this community, and how can this community be part of us? And one of the schemes that they used to do that was a funding scheme for bringing disabled people to the farm, to work on the farm. It's, again, closely related to the green care movement that I was mentioning before, of putting school children or different sort of social initiatives on the farm. And they found that there were some people that was very easy to integrate in the farm. You gave them a job and they were quite happy to do that job. And then there were some people that you really had to think very differently about how do we do things in order to make it possible for these people to work comfortably here. And one of the people that they had to really work very hard for, to sort of win, in a sense, to bring them into the farm, was a man who couldn't stand conflict. He really, if there was any conflict, he would just break down. And this was really hard for them to deal with, because in such an expanded enterprise where they were trying to do this collaboratively and bring in everybody in the decision-making process, there was inevitably conflict sometimes. Well, not inevitably, actually. They changed their communication structures in a way to support harmonious communication between all the different parts of the farm. And they, of course, found that this was incredibly good for all of them. It meant that they weren't in conflict with each other, and that's great. But that wouldn't have happened if they hadn't have had this idea of integrating this man for whom that was just really hard to deal with, and they maybe didn't realize what a stress it was putting on them to have conflict within it, because it maybe didn't happen so often, but it happened often enough that it needed to be dealt with. And another really nice example there was the main farmer, the guy who runs everything, the manager. He had one young man, or teenager possibly, who he didn't like to be with a lot of different people. He liked this main farmer, and he wanted to work with him. And there was a lot of things that this young man thought that he couldn't do, and didn't particularly feel capable of doing. And the farmer would just start very small. He'd be working in the stables and say, well, just pass me that spade, will you? And the boy would go get the spade and bring him the spade. And then he'd say, well, just move this bit of manure over there. And then he'd just do that. And then after a while, they built up a set of things for this man to do. So he was doing a job, and then the farmer would move on to a different job, and he'd start the same way of saying, well, just pull out that plant right there and just throw it over there. So he'd do that, and he'd say, well, if you see another one of these plants, just pull that one out as well and just throw it over there. And so he'd build up a job by lots of individual steps. And at the time when I was talking to the farmer, he was saying that this man now knows more jobs on the farm than anyone else. He's the person who is probably like best qualified to take over the farm when the farmer eventually leaves, because he knows how everything works, because he's just trailed him. He's just followed him for the last 4 or 5 years to and learned all of these different jobs and how they all interact with each other. He knows everybody on the farm because he's always been with the farm. And it's this flexibility of thinking about what we do and what people can do in this environment that I find key to the healthy farm. And there's obviously with that there's a lot of social relationships and interactions that have to be organised a particular way for it to work in that community. There's a scale that the farm needs to have for it to work in that community, and at the moment at least they seem to have found a right way of communicating and a right scale that works well for their health and the health of that community. It wouldn't necessarily work the same way for a different community, and that's why I think it's necessary to have, like I said, farmers who see the relevance for themselves and build it themselves with their communities instead of it coming from the top down. Because if you have it from the top down, it's a blueprint version that's not organic. It's not natural. It's not addressing the health needs or just the needs, I suppose, of that community and the capacities of that community and the flexibilities that exist in that community. Which seems to me to be at least quite necessary for those interconnections to be more than just sort of rigid, almost like lines drawn on a diagram. They should be flexible. They should be able to develop and grow and, in a sense, sort of die off as well. And I think part of it's a good relationship to what I feel like health is anyway. It's not health 100% super healthy all the time. You have to allow it to also die back a bit, to try things that don't work out, to get sick and then rebound, to be able to develop and to think a bit more in the long term about your own health or the health of the community. So if you don't have that flexibility, it seems like it probably wouldn't, in the long term, last very well.
Yeah. One intriguing aspect of the Swiss example, as we spoke about it before, was their accommodation of animals.
Mm-hmm.
Could you say just a little bit about that?
Well, I sort of should preface it with that I'm not an expert in animal husbandry at all. So it was sort of a non-expert view on the whole thing, and then they obviously told us a lot about it as well. So they had cows, dairy cows, and they had a bull that walked with the herd all the time. And the farmer was very clear that in this herd, the bull is the boss. And whenever I step onto the field with the herd, the bull is the boss, and I'm stepping into his territory, and I have to make allowances for the fact that he's in charge on this field, which is probably a personal safety sort of thing as well as just good manners. And in other aspects as well, they tried to adapt their farm to the natural behaviours of the herd. So they had worked out that it was quite natural for cows to, for example, to sort of hide their calves away for a little while after they'd been born, while they were still feeding off the cow's milk, and the mother cow would wander off for a while with the herd and then return to the calf. And they thought, well, we can use this to make sure that our cows aren't really stressed by the separation from the calf, because it would be usual basically to remove the calf altogether, because you don't want them drinking the milk from the dairy cow. And so they kept the calves up at the farm, where the farm buildings were, where the dairy was, and the milking station was, and it meant that they would allow the calves to interact with the cows. I think either before or after the milking, I'm not entirely sure, for a while, and then they could wander off back to the field. But it meant that the cows were really happy to go to the milking shed, for one thing, and they'd go through the milking in a much more stress-free way. They could kind of talk to their calves while they were being milked and while they were on the farm site. The calves were also less stressed, and you could keep them for longer, so you could sell them off when they're older. And they were also quite happy to leave them again, which is important. I mean, if you've heard a calf and a cow calling to each other across a field, or from the stables to the field, it's absolutely heartbreaking. And that wasn't. When I was there, I never saw it as being heartbreaking. The cows just wandered off, and it was all very calm and all very relaxed, and there was no real fuss about it. And the bull stood and watched the entire time. He was just supervising, and it was nice. And then the relationship between the farmer and the bull was very special as well. They mentioned that he didn't have a hard time sending the cows off to slaughter. That was okay. He didn't feel bad about that. But the bull was with him for such a long time that he developed a special relationship, and they needed to have a special relationship for him to be able to enter the field safely and to deal with the cows safely. So they had to build up a trust, which meant that at the end of the bull's life, it was a very sad time for him, for the farmer. And so he would always kill the bull himself. He would always go out to the field and talk to the bull and spend a bit of time with him, and then kill him. And it was a way for him to, I think, allow himself to complete this process of this relationship with the animal that sending the animal off to slaughter would not do, to get some sort of a fitting end to the whole life of this relationship that they had. So it was, again, just a very practical, but also emotional and very calm and very thought out way of doing farming, which I really appreciated.
given your appreciation of all this, do you think you're a city person forever?
I've never been a city person. I grew up in the country, and I didn't grow up on a farm, but I grew up in a farming community. Although the farms weren't very present in our community for me when I was a child, and I'm terrible at being a city person. I don't take advantage of the stuff that the city has to offer at all. I don't go to museums much. I quite like them when I go, but I don't really do them. I mean, this is Vienna, and people come here to go to the museums, and I really haven't been much. I like the opera when I go, but I don't go terribly often. I think I would love to live out in the countryside again, but I have to be close enough to find work that I want to do. I by no means want to be a farmer. I think it would just be, for me, I like to travel, and I like to move around. And when you have a farm, you can't really do that so much. And I've absolutely not found the place where I want to settle down and live yet. So, no, I wouldn't do that. But I would like to be able to live outside of the city. And go for nice walks.
How do you imagine, as a researcher or as a person who writes about health and agriculture, in this very broad way that you think about health and agriculture, how do you imagine yourself being useful to communities, say in Austria?
Well, I think that has a lot to do with the kind of research that I'd like to do, and I'm not really doing that now with the PhD.
That's okay. I mean, I wasn't thinking about what you're doing now, but about your aspirations.
Well, I would really like to be more involved with a kind of science that takes its starting point from the communities themselves and gets its motivation from the communities themselves, to try to deal with maybe a bit more everyday problems as opposed to sort of the really grand, or maybe in addition to the grand ideas. And I know that does happen. It happens a lot, and I feel like it's maybe not happening so much in the field that I'm involved in at the moment. I would like to. I quite like the movement in social science towards facilitating social change or social processes, where the scientist comes in, where the community has an issue that they want to deal with, the scientist comes in as someone who knows the community. I mean, you have to, in a way, if you want to capitalize in a way on the possibilities that exist in the community, and then use your knowledge of the way social processes work to give ideas, to give advice, to help facilitate the community in solving their own problems. And then your research part of that would actually be on the social process of how does a community create change, and how can the community deal with particular types of problems. And I like the idea a little bit, like you do with collecting lives. I like the idea of collecting problems and different ways of dealing with problems, different ways of untangling knots. And I think the most useful way of doing that is for the communities themselves, whoever they may be, to deal with it themselves, to find the solutions themselves. But I think that that's a very difficult thing. Like an example from my hometown is, and it's one that I wish I could have been there to study because it was fantastically interesting. The church in my hometown in Norway burned down a few years ago, and it was very there was a lot of conflict around that because there were a lot of accusations that flew around early on, and then there was a lot of conflict that came about because they had to pick a design for a new church, and the community very nearly tore itself apart over this. There was some people felt like they should decide because their families had been there for 1,000 years or so, and other people felt that they should decide because they actually went to the church, and the threshold for being a local suddenly got very high, and people who had been there for 2-3 generations were now no longer considered local, even if their families had moved from the next village over. And it became this really sort of embittered battle. And I think it's a good example of the fact that sometimes a community, it can solve its own problems. There's no reason why they couldn't solve that on their own, but that it's maybe helpful to have a person there who can facilitate that project and who's from the outside and can take a bit more of a neutral stance to the process. And also can lend a bit of a voice or an understanding of how a lot of the communication takes place, especially if you're working, if it's a community trying to do something in opposition to an oil company that wants to drill in your bay, for example. Well, then the community's arguments are different from the company's arguments, and who does the local council listen to, or the regional council listen to in giving consent for the oil drilling? Well, the company's arguments might be, the income, the extra jobs, the taxes. They can show some environmental, an assessment to show that they're not going to do an awful lot of damage. And the community's argument might be, well, we like our bay, we've lived here for a long time, we moved here because we like the quiet, we like the view in the morning, I used to swim off this beach when I was a kid, and there's potentially the arguments are completely mismatched, and it's nice to have someone there then who can capture that and say, these arguments are not fitting into the strict legal framework of this consent process, but they're real and they have to be addressed in a way that potentially the community couldn't do themselves. And so I think that it's that facilitating role can be really interesting and really valuable, and that's what I would quite like to do, while also doing the research. I wouldn't want to just do that. I would like to have the research side of it as well.